Everyone, thanks for having me here. I am going to hopefully leave you with one sort of commercial for a variable in the UAS data set that people's experiences with technology. It relates to loneliness, it relates to well-being. Technology is a variable that interacts with many things in our lives, our political attitudes, polarization, and so we are tracking it. And I'm hopeful that not only will I convince you this is a good variable, but that I will convince you that you can collaborate with us on this variable using the UAS panel. And so before I moved to USC, I actually worked at Meta for about 4.5 years. I worked on all sorts of how do we make the platform better for users. I started off as a data science manager. So I'm gonna tell you this history actually in part because this is part of my story of why I've come to believe in user experience measurement. So I was a data science manager. I counted things like how many times people encountered misinformation, how many times people reported bullying and harassment. I realized that we could drive these numbers really low and we still wouldn't solve the problem, because a lot of times what users thought was harmful was not what we thought was harmful as per our policies as a platform. And so I joined research where I could actually ask users, what do you think is harmful? And how does that map onto our policies? We tried to close some of those policy gaps, but we weren't always successful, in part because it's really hard to objectively define like what causes hate in people, or what is actually misinformation versus just misleading. And I'll give you an example. I usually like to use the example of fear speech, because you see it everywhere in the world once you hear about it. There's a PNAS paper that looks for hate speech online, and what they find is a lot of what they call fear speech. I worked there during the George Floyd protests, and the form it took was like, there are members, these protests, there are members of Antifa as part of these protests. You should show up, defend your community against these members of Antifa. And unfortunately, some people did show up armed, and people were killed. The problem is it's really hard to, it's certainly misleading, but it's hard to disprove a negative before the fact, right? Can you prove that no one, before the fact, no one who's going to come to your town had any connection, has ever been to a meeting, of Antifa? It's hard to prove that, right, as a factual statement. And so there are all sorts of these like fear statements that you can make. People do it internationally, there are a lot of things we should be afraid of, right? Like if you're in Ukraine, you probably should be afraid of the Russians, and so like you can't legislate what you can and can't be afraid of, and if you do so, you get often over enforcement, censorship concerns that you see commonly made to social media companies. So I often go around and I talk about moderation is not the answer. We should instead focus on design. And I talk about the specific design choices we made. In this setting, you guys are probably more interested in like how we measure the results. So I'm going to speed through this next section, but I'll tell you, all of what we did was really, instead of focusing on enforcing our policies, like how can we think about the user experience and improve that instead? How can we remove bad experiences or harmful experiences instead of things that violate our hate speech policy? And so some of the things we did were removing engagement incentives. So instead of incentivizing health content that gets the most comments back and forth, which you can imagine the kind of health content that gets lots of comments back and forth, instead optimizing it for other signals. We might instead survey people. What do you think is a high quality piece of content? What do you think is a high quality comment? We could ask you, did you have a good experience over your last session? And try to optimize for people's explicit experiences. I actually use, it's funny, the donuts came in. I often use this analogy of kale versus donuts. Because oftentimes engagement is kind of like donuts. Like if you put a donut in front of me, I will engage with it. And so bad content's kind of like that too. If you put a fight video in front of me, I might watch it. But I don't aspire to watch more fight videos. I will just do it if you put it in front of me, right? So if you ask users what they want, you actually get very different answers than if you just watch what they do, right? Like a lot of people don't want to watch disgusting content, but they will watch it if you put it in front of them, and an algorithm will pick up on that. So we added surveys, we asked people their explicit preferences, and oftentimes we'd add UI elements that sort of map to surveys. Do you want to see more or see less of that content? We put a little X in the upper right of some posts and said, you can tell us you don't like something. You don't have to tell us it violates a policy, just so you don't like it. And then a lot of bad experiences are also caused by small groups of users causing bad experiences. Maybe there's lonely men, who we heard about earlier. It's usually teenagers, actually. And so these small groups of users cause bad experiences for a lot of other people. And any ways we can reduce the power of small groups of users, through rate limiting or functionality limiting, it improves the environment for everyone. So I often will talk about our design code, and I go to various places and talk about how we should regulate social media and design it differently. But here I'm going to talk about how we would measure if that actually succeeded, right? How would we know that better experiences were happening for users? And so this is a screenshot from an internal dashboard at Meta, which has since become public, like many things at Meta. And you can see that like that little blip there is users telling us that they are seeing content that they think could lead to violence in their community, right? This is not content that violates our violence incitement policy. They are telling us they're experiencing content that they think could lead to violence, right? And it's that dichotomy that others have pointed out too. So in the kids safety space, Arturo Bahar is a recent sort of Facebook whistleblower, came out and said, about over 10% of kids will report that they've been bullied and harassed on Instagram in the last 7 days, right? That's in a 7-day period. Even though the metrics for bullying and harassment are really low, right? So user experience can really get you at harms. And you could argue that actually the ground truth for being bullied is your subjective experience, right? Because it's really hard for someone on the outside to see what's happening online and know like that's bullying. So together with the wonderful people at the Center for Economic and Social Research, we've replicated some of this. The nice thing about user experience measurement is you don't have to be at a platform to do it, right? Anyone can ask a representative sample of the population, what are your experiences with social media, and understand, are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Are they good on some platforms? Are they better on other platforms? We use a lot of the same survey questions that were developed at Meta. So the bad for the world question might not seem like an intuitive question, but people don't know what's misinformation, what's hate, what's polarization. Like they just know it's bad, right? Something bad happened, right? And then we can ask them questions about what they mean by bad. But and so there is data that shows that correlates well with misinformation, violence incitement, et cetera. These kinds of content that we want less of. So we've been working with UAS for I guess almost a year now, and we've done 4 waves. We're in the middle of our 5th, and a lot of our results have been kind of stable. Like we've picked up on some things. This is people's usage of various technology platforms. We include things like email and text messaging in part because we want have baselines. The only thing you see here is that YouTube's gone down a bit. Maybe there's a short form video effect. We can't tell you why. We can just tell you, just observe these patterns. This is really the money shot. This is kind of what we go around trying to talk to people about, is the comparisons across platforms. And this is what percentage of people who use this platform say that they have seen something that they think is bad for the world over the last 4 weeks. Or what percentage who use this platform have said that they've been personally negative affected over the last 4 weeks. And you can see that the goal is not 0, right? The goal is not that bad things are going to happen online, just like bad things happen offline. But the fact that you can go on to LinkedIn and you can go on to Pinterest and you can experience a lot less negative content, you're a lot less likely to experience something that affects you negatively. You're a lot less likely to see something bad for the world than you are on, say, Twitter. I think the counterfactual is maybe Twitter is not doing things as well as they could, right? And that's the kind of pressure we want to put on these companies to relative to other companies, could you be doing a better job? And we don't just measure the negative side, we also measure the positive side. So we look at, where are people saying they're connecting with other people, where are people learning new things? And you can also see people say they learn more on LinkedIn than they do on Twitter, right? So there are some platforms where you have a lot more positive experiences and you don't have to deal with all the negative experiences that some platforms have. We also collect some number of dependent variables. So we didn't realize that you had all this loneliness data. So we collected it ourselves with the UCLA loneliness scale. And so we have, there's some platforms where people say they have lots of meaningful connections on the upper left here. And they're less likely to say they're lonely as a user base, right? And then there are more traditional social media platforms where people are less likely to say they have a meaningful experience and they're more likely to report they're lonely. Now, I can't tell you 100% what this means, but this is just an observation. We're still sort of diving into it. But the great thing about the UAS is you guys could go help us explore it together, right? So there's a lot of follow-up stuff to be done. And so just examples of what do we do with this data? So I live in the Bay Area and I worked at one of these companies, and a lot of my friends have been moved across companies. And so one of the main things we do, honestly, is we try to promote it within companies to help them make the case for the kinds of change that we want to see. And this was really useful when I was a research manager trying to make the cases for things as well. So on the lower right, there's someone from Pinterest who presented our data back to us at one of our conferences. And we're just really happy that they found it useful that to use that data. We've had Twitter didn't interact with our data directly. They actually interacted with it through the media. So, there are other objective measures or where people have shown that there's more hate speech on Twitter. And then they also cited our user experience measure as a good complement, right? So there's some conversion validity there. And then to sort of force Twitter to respond because they may not care about the metric, but they do care about what advertisers think about the metric, right? And then the quote on the upper right is one of my favorite. I got recently, just out of the blue, an email from someone from Nextdoor who said that they're a big fan of our indices. And Nextdoor is the platform, if you remember the data before, that where a lot of people were experiencing a lot of negative things personally. And so he was saying like, look, I've been making these points internally a long time. This has been really helpful for me to show that like there's some external validation for it. So, this is the same data that Marco presented the other day, but I just want to illustrate, like, we also talk about the UAS AI data, and we had sort of a similar idea, so we had eventually decided to merge efforts. But the goal here, a lot of times what we talk about is that, not that many people are using AI. It was 18% of people have used AI. They're really using it out of curiosity. They're really finding it more useful than harmful, right? So there's not a lot of current harm, but as these things start to grow and people start using them for connection and other things, we want to track them, those experiences ahead of time so that we don't get into the same trap we've done with social media, arguably, where we're sort of like catching up to the harms. And so we have a lot of applied goals, but we also do have some academic projects. We have some measures of well-being. We have some measure of loneliness that I mentioned, but we are seeking new collaborators, and that's one reason I'm here. So just think about what else could experiences with technology predict. Is there something that, is there some way you could use this data? Are there ways that we could connect technology use to financial outcomes, right? Because people fall prey to financial scams. There's all sorts of things that I've just come up with from being here and hearing all the other data being collected, and love to collaborate with folks on that. So if you're interested, so again, measures of user experience with technology are really important or helpful. Hopefully you have some greater appreciation for them. You could collaborate with us on that using the UAS, and that's my email. And a lot of our results are actually on our Substack. So if you subscribe to our Substack, you can get our results and analyses directly. Thanks.